to do what you do, love. Under the mystery. To do what you don't love. The only reason is to do what you do love. Ponder the mystery. Ponder the mystery. I have no answer to the question.
I think it's extremely inspiring for artists because Henry was inspired by a lot of things from that he was surrounded by. He was collecting, magazine, books, a lot of different things, and he was creating. In a way, as a musician, I can see as sampling. He was sampling like a musician is sampling some old records, some vintage records to create a new kind of music, like hip hop was based on that, or I do that all the time. I sample from my record collection. And Henry was sampling like images from books, magazine, papers, and he creates from that as a self-taught artist, and I feel very close, connected to that because I'm also a self-taught artist, self-taught musician, sorry. And in a way, it shows that you can do everything from scratch, or not from scratch, but from anything that was surrounding you. And also for me, it's inspiring, particularly in this world we are now, where everything is so connected with the world. We are so connected through the social medias and students. That Henry Darger was the opposite of that. He creates like a huge amount of work of art without showing to anyone, which means that in this world where we wanted to be liked on Instagram, liked on Facebook, and we show everything that we do, even what we are eating, Henry didn't show to anyone because, and it's really the question and it's the main thing mostly for the outsider artists. It's that they create by necessity. And it's
right.
Very strong, very powerful when you just create art for art and for nothing else, not to be loved, liked, or appreciated so maybe I would love to know why he didn't want to show it to others, why he wanted to keep for himself. I would love to know that. And I would talk also about music with him because And in this room, there was a lot of wax records, like a big amount of like a big collection of wax records. And even on the website, you can find also on Spotify also the playlist of the music that he was listening, because thanks to Mike Bonsil, he sent me because Darger was writing everything, like mostly everything, and he was writing all the records that he was buying with a price, and I had this list, and from that I did like the playlist to know what's to understand a bit better the man behind the art, and for me as a musician, of course, it's very interesting to listen to the music that he was listening during his life, or that he was collecting. So it's very interesting to see that he was collecting jazz records, classical music, even sketch, I say sketch like a stand-up comedy. What he was doing visually with like sampling, like let's say the image of Shirley Temple or the girl from Copperton commercials, and duplicating and creating his own characters like that. That's exactly what he did also with the lyrics.
I think I related to Henry's work both in the sense of this theory of production, reproduction, this idea how in an age of reproduction, how we are using these reproductive techniques for creative purposes. And Henry did something that on one hand, or many children, right, copying, and I remember myself as a kid looking on different images that were coming to me through the words of storytelling, advertising, and in different ways, copying them, taking them, replacing their context, and through that saying something new. So I think, understanding Henry through that was huge.
Intuit owns a lot of his ephemera, his objects, including coloring book pages that he used. And so if you look at this image of your work, giant sunflowers, giant roses, these are all the kinds of images that were found in Henry's work, but many of these were lifted from the coloring book pages that he owned. And he would take those coloring pages to the drugstore and have them sent off for photographic reproductions or enlargements or reductions. And I think that we're all familiar with the multiplicity of children that, the same child over and over again appearing in that artwork, but the same thing happened with the gardens in Henry Darger's work. And one of the things, it's so interesting to me that these were projected on this giant Mart 2 football fields size palette, and in many of the images, the sunflowers or the trees or the flowers are enormous compared to the size of the humans or the mythical creatures in Henry's work.
Yeah, I think that, and it was another step of exactly what he was doing, right? Like it's taking them, reproducing them, changing them as a part of the reproduction. Here it was the scale, here it was the notion of time. The general notion of artistic practice, right? When we as artists we say things, right? It's the way that I understand art making is about communicating the things that are important to us. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about communication, that means we're talking to somebody. And in the case of Henry, the question of audience is
it's a mystery.
It's a mystery. And I think that's really interesting and also important for us as artists to think, when we think about who are we talking to?
Penrod's eyes for a moment were blinded by a veil of horror, for it seemed to him they were looking upon a mad carnival of fiends, in purple and gray, fighting madly, like two parties of demons contending for the woods, and that they had come up too late to save Janie at all. And all in a glance, with the yells and blasphemies of a savage foe splitting the air, he looked to the rear where the big fire was coming fast and furious. More than this, Penrod did not see, for overwhelming hordes of Glandolinians had attacked the soldiers from all sides, and it seemed a fiercer outburst of cries rent the air as the soldiers appeared to give way for the gray uniformed demons. Evans and his force were doomed, and with it all that Penrod loved on earth, for in this fatal forest he had lost his boy and Girl Scouts and best friends in death. Then came from the Glandolinians a great and most terrible cry, as if black and mysterious spirits of the forest had been suddenly possessing the air, coming and going with the screaming winds, creatures of evil and darkness, an evil omen, shadows of black and frightful death. Never had Penrod or Gertrude yet, in all their lives, heard such cries from the Glandolinians, a fearful cry, for it was not only a sound worse than that of madness, but of fiendish hell itself. a wailing and shrieking and terrible cry, mingled with blasphemies terrible to hear, that began as a sobbing moan and grew in terrific volume until it seemed to fill all space with a deafening roar, and to stir with a vibrant horror the earth itself. It did not sound like either the cry of man or beast, no yelling of the forest, no bawl or scream of wind, but rather the mysterious mystery of gargantuan monsters of space, beginning in a tempest of noise, rising to a deafening tumult, and dying away at last in a plaintive sob that seemed to lose itself in the distance, only to break loose suddenly once more in redoubled volume. With their eyes drawn by the crazy sound, Penrod and the others looked on that scene of war madness, of which General Greatheart had told him, the famous and dreaded devil yell of the Glandolinians. The Glandolinians fought like the demons of hell and madness combined, and the air was yet trembling with the horror of the outcries when Penrod blazed away. Penrod fired straight through the heart of one of the nearest rebels. The rifles of David and Radcliffe cracked at his side, and they could not miss. And now, like a scourge of doom, the rangers and soldiers sent by General Ehrenberg appeared. Had it been possible, the rebels would have fled for their very lives now, but they were caught between the contending Christian forces and the approaching fire behind, and therefore they prepared and redoubled energy to meet the newcomers. The rangers, reinforced by the newcomers, leaped with a fixed bayonet or clubbed rifle to wreak vengeance on the makers of the forest fires and the slayers of women and children. They, too, rushed in mad and shrieking fury upon the Glandolinians, who had come to try and frustrate their firefighting purposes. Even then, the Glandolinians, driven to panic, might have broken before those purple and terrible figures, but they were hemmed in between the soldiers and the rangers. Madness raced suddenly in the blood of both sides, and to the inhuman yells and screams and blasphemies of the insurgents was added the savage and malevolent cries of the national soldiers, which had been forced from their lips at the start of the first fight.
without having much of a plan, we actually decided we had a very short time to empty out the room and get the materials. So here's a slide that shows in 1999, piles and piles of wrapped, bundled newspapers and magazines, a dresser, the hamper with his collection of yarn and balls of string. And the room just seemed like a mysterious gold mine of the place where Henry lived and worked. And so if you can advance through the next few slides, we'll show very quickly we had a group of Intuit volunteers that here's another view of the main wall, what we considered the main wall, piles and piles of his absolutely beautifully customized art making supplies. And so Intuit volunteers in one short weekend, we did a inventory process, packed everything, including the furniture, and moved it to Intuit's storage area. And then we had to figure out, it took a number of years to just determine a space into its current location where the we always talked about it, or I always talked about it with Jessica Moss, my co-curator, and we talked about it as an evocation of the original room, not a recreation or a replication. We didn't have enough documentation of what it was like. So we were able to get a couple of major elements, architectural elements, including the fireplace mantle and the tile surround, which you see on the back wall, and the chandelier that was over his table. And we just kind of did it in the spirit of Henry Darger, using what he had. And so it was in 2008 when we finally had the room organized for reinstallation. Have been in, I don't know if it's hundreds is an exaggeration, but many, many, many artist spaces and preserved spaces. And there's kind of a gut punch that you don't necessarily anticipate when you step into a place, and it's the real materials. And with Darger, it hits on a really tender, I think, level because of the incredible fragility of almost everything in the room, and how if you in this image you can see bundles and bundles of really old newspaper and magazines and things that also probably may never be unbundled. It's an enormous amount of material, but it's so important now because it's all physical. He's pre-digital. There is nothing digitized. There's nothing. Everything was printed the old world way and hand done and hands on. And I think that in itself is enormously impactful to people of all ages, but especially young people.